to the maiden edition of Africa Unfiltered, a video podcast produced by Vital Voices for Africa, VVA. VVA is a catalyst for transformative change in Africa. Headquartered in Lomé, Togo, the non-profit organization has a resolute mission to foster resilience and promote sustainable development in Africa. Its objective is to strengthen and amplify the voices of African communities in sustainable development and to drive transformative change by undertaking initiatives to promote and support a resilient future for the continent. Africa bears the brunt of climate change despite contributing only about 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Compare that to countries like China and the United States, and you see the stark imbalance. The World Bank predicts that Africa's average annual temperature could rise an additional 3 to 4 degrees by 2099. But it's not just about numbers, it's also about lives. More than 110 million people in Africa were directly affected by weather-related hazards in 2022 alone. Devastating floods, storms, and droughts wreaked havoc, causing over $8.5 billion in economic damages. Between the 1970s and 2010 to 2019, climate hazards in Africa surged from 85 recorded events to about 540. Floods, storms, and droughts became more frequent, leaving scars on communities and landscapes. You should have guessed it right by now. This maiden edition of Africa Unfiltered will discuss climate change and its devastating consequences in Africa. And to do that for us is Dr. Kituyi, Kituyi, a development professional with over 20 years of experience in program and project management. He's a development professional with 20 years of experience in program and project management, development research and strategy. His key areas of interest include sustainable energy, climate change, and the green economy, as well as building technical skills for development. He is passionate about bridging research evidence to policy and practice towards inclusive and resilient development, with significant work experience in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Kituyi is currently actively providing technical consultancy services on sustainability and climate risk management to diverse clientele. He is a senior associate of the Institute for Climate Change and Adaptation, ICCA, of the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and has previously served as senior program specialist at Canada's IDRC, overseeing programming on climate resilient economic development in Africa and Asia. Dr. Evans Kituyi, thank you very much for joining us today. What a rich profile you have.
Thank you.
So, first things first, climate change. This is something people hear every day on TV, on the news, on radio, they read in newspapers and on the internet, and they hear about conferences are going on. What really is climate change? And I want us to talk about the layman on the street. To them, how can they be affected by climate change? First of all, what is it, and how could it maybe impact the everyday person on the street of Africa?
Thank you very much, Caleb, for that introduction and the invitation to share my perspectives on what climate change really is and its impacts and how best we can tackle it. So climate change really refers to that long-term change in temperature or rainfall, or as we call it scientifically, precipitation, and other atmospheric conditions on the Earth. It is primarily driven by human activities such as burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, industrial processes, and so on, which increase the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it is these gases that will then, in effect, cause the warming to happen over these long periods of time. So how the layman feels it, one is from food security. changes in rainfall patterns, for example, they affect agricultural productivity, leading to food shortages and higher prices. Water scarcity, reduced rainfall, for example, prolonged droughts, they all impact water availability for drinking, for farming, and for sanitation. The other ways in which the common man would feel it is in the area of health. Increased heat waves and changes in disease patterns, for example, malaria, dengue, they're all changing patterns. Some areas which had malaria in the past today do not have malaria, and others that never had, the disease has shifted there. So these are some of the ways in which the common man is feeling it. And then also when it comes to livelihoods, you find that many Africans rely on agriculture and natural resources for their livelihoods, making them vulnerable to climate impacts. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Evans Kituyi. I see a lot of impact in what you're saying, and a lot of knowledge that we really don't know about, that people will be getting on this podcast today. There has been a lot of information on the news these days about extreme heat. I know in West Africa, where I currently am, and I also recall a similar situation happening in Eastern Africa as well. And I think this even led to the death of cattle, of some animals across the continent. Of course, this has been attributed to climate change. But tell us more about this, and perhaps explain weather patterns, natural resources, or ecosystems that are affected by the climate change phenomenon. I know you talked about it, you mentioned it just a while ago, but can we go further, especially with the extreme heat that we are facing this time around in Africa?
Yeah, one thing is people always confuse between weather and climate change. So maybe I just want to clarify that a bit. I would say weather to a common man is what you see out there now. When you look through the window, what do you see? Or what is the temperature like out there right now? Okay? What is the precipitation situation? What's the moisture levels? And all this, whatever you're seeing outside there in terms of temperature, for example, that gives you the weather conditions right now. Okay? That is not climate.
Yes.
So climate on the other side is the long term. For example, if I take a period of 10 to 30 years, okay, and I take the average temperature, rainfall, moisture pattern, wind pattern, etc. If I take that average over about 30 years, that will give me climate. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, maybe consider that was taken maybe in the early 19th century, over some 30 years. Then come today and take the average conditions over the last 30 years from today backwards. So you'll find that what you get now as this average compared to the average of about 30 years, which you took many years ago, there is a difference. So that difference is the climate change.
Yes.
I hope that clarifies.
Yes. Sure.
So the in terms of weather patterns, they are bound to become more frequent because of this climate change. They are bound to become more frequent. Intense extreme weather events like storms and droughts and heavier floods, like we've been experiencing most recently in the Eastern Africa region. Then in terms of natural resources, we expect to see reduced water availability, soil degradation, changes in the availability of fish and other natural resources, for example. And then thirdly, we also expect to see how do I call it? Ecosystem changes, like for example losses in biodiversity, like shifting habitats, where like in the Sahel you expect to see maybe our vegetation disappearing, moving northwards, that kind of thing. Or stressed ecosystems like the coral reefs and the savannas, we expect to see a lot of change happening in those areas as a result of climate change. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Now, we are in a continent where people have gotten accustomed to a hard life. An everyday African who struggles to get a decent meal every day might not identify with the devastation you are enumerating here. This devastation, of course, which we are all attributing now to climate change. An everyday African might not identify with this because life is really hard for them every day. And so sometimes they have the tendency to integrate climate change in their hard life, if you understand what I mean. So to them, they don't feel concerned. No, it's normal. We have untold hardship every day. How dangerous is such a situation? And I'm asking this question because people actually are facing deadly consequences of this climate change without even knowing it, because they attribute it to the normal hard life.
Okay. Just like you have said, the people in the rural areas are not affected similarly like those in the urban areas. The rich and the poor are affected also differently. The children and women are also affected differently, and so on. So the impact of climate change really depends on the adaptive capacities, and the adaptive capacities, of course, will vary depending on what kind of resources one is exposed to. So, for example, the rural communities, their dependence on agriculture and natural resources makes them highly susceptible to changes in weather and resource availability. Okay, the urban poor, they are vulnerable to heat waves, for example, water scarcity, which results as a major consequence of climate change, and food price increases. Because you see, since they don't cultivate in the city, they have to buy food on the market to come and cook. And the prices are bound to be high because where the food is sourced from is impacted and is producing less food perhaps. So they have to import food, for example, from other countries or other far-flung areas to bring to the urban area. So the prices are bound to be affected. Then women and children often have fewer resources and less mobility to adapt to climate impacts. We even want to talk about the older people, the seniors in community and so on. Those also have very fewer resources to depend on in cases of climate change. And then, of course, the worst hit include small island nations and coastal areas. Okay, so these ones are prone to sea level rise and extreme weather events, and I think we've seen that happen in some of the coastal areas in Africa. Even more recently, countries like Mozambique have really suffered that. Mauritius and a lot of the small islands in the Indian Ocean. We've really seen a lot of terrible impacts most recently.
I'm so glad you're saying this, because these are things that happen in our communities. They are realities, and I think we can now begin to understand how our lives as Africans really are impacted by this issue of climate change, something which we sometimes tend to imagine that it really doesn't concern us as Africans. Thank you very much for that. Now, Dr. Kituyi, you said this in the beginning. You talked about greenhouse gas emissions, and each time there is climate change, there's talk of climate change, there is always reference to greenhouse gas emissions. The question I want to ask you is, what role can Africa play in global efforts to reduce greenhouse emissions? But first, I would like you to maybe tell us more about these greenhouse gas emissions. What exactly are they? In order for us to better understand the question, I'd like you to first of all tell us what these greenhouse emissions are, and then and how, of course, they cause climate change. and then explain to us maybe what you think Africa can do. I know there is, of course, a global effort to reduce them, but how Africa can do to effectively contribute to these efforts. Or what Africa can do to contribute to these efforts.
Okay, thank you very much. I think without going into the science, I'm just trying to explain in a simple way that greenhouse gases have the ability to trap heat within the Earth's atmosphere, okay? Contributing to the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is, I'm sure we have all entered vehicles that have been parked in the sun for a long time. When you enter those cars, you find that they're so hot, they're hotter than even outside, okay? It is because the sun's rays, the UV rays were able to penetrate into the infrared light, penetrate through the glass, and then it gets trapped in there, and it hits and warms the interior of the vehicle, and therefore losing some energy, and those waves are now not able to go back outside, or very little able to penetrate the glass and go out, because they have lost energy that would have had them penetrate through the glass, okay? So it gets trapped in there. So the same phenomena happens in the Earth's atmosphere, whereby high up there, the greenhouse gases that have accumulated over many years, okay, they form some kind of a blanket in the atmosphere, so that when the sun's rays, infrared, they hit the Earth, they get reflected back into the atmosphere, and they're not able to penetrate through that blanket in the atmosphere, and so they are trapped by the gases, the carbon dioxide, for example, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases, which have got the ability to trap heat and then exert the warming on the Earth. So,
and by so doing, protecting us who are on Earth, us humans, and human life and animal life on Earth, I guess.
Yeah. Just we need that warmth. Otherwise, without these gases, the world would be a frozen place.
Exactly.
The Earth would be a frozen place. Yeah. So we have those as the major gases: carbon dioxide, that is emitted mainly from the burning of fossil fuels and so on, deforestation and industrial processes. We have another one like methane, which is released from livestock digestion. Rice paddies, for example, when you produce rice, landfills and municipal waste dumps and so on, and fossil fuel extraction. Nitrous oxide comes mainly from agriculture, the fertilizers as we use, for example, and the fluorinated gases are mainly synthetic. They are produced to be used in industrial processes and also in refrigeration systems, for example. In the refrigerators we use, that is one of the applications. Now, you asked me to talk about what role Africa can play in reducing these gases. One is just to acknowledge that on a per capita basis, we produce very little as Africans. You can't compare that with what the Northerners produce per person, but there is, in the spirit of teamwork to tackle the climate change question, everybody has to participate by mitigating that in their own small ways. So in Africa, for example, the use of renewable energy is particularly key. If we invest in solar energy, wind energy, hydropower, to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, that is one easy way for us to do that. Or forest conservation, protecting and restoring forests to act as carbon sinks. That is another way in which we in Africa can contribute. Another one is in sustainable agriculture, because a lot of our people are employed in agriculture, and we rely so much on agriculture for our day-to-day survival. So we can take advantage of applications in agriculture to mitigate that by promoting practices that reduce emissions and enhance carbon sequestration in soil, for example. And then finally, of course, we need very good policies to be in place. We need to engage in international climate negotiations very actively, the way Africa has increasingly been doing, and also implementing national policies to reduce climate emissions. Yeah.
All right. Now, I have this question to ask. It might be part of what you've talked about now, but I want to talk about our way of life in Africa, our customs, our traditions. And you mentioned it a while ago. We do our traditional farming. We do. There are certain, as Africans, there are certain things we do that is our culture and our tradition. And some of these practices may not particularly align with best practices, climate-based practices. So, how can these traditional practices, this traditional knowledge and practices merge with knowledge science? How can the two work together to ensure effective climate adaptation?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've had, for millennia, over the years, our forefathers have used, for example, different ways of forecasting the seasons and climate in their own ways. For example, using certain birds to tell whether it's coming to rain or not, or using certain ants and insects that pop out of the ground, or certain flowers which only do their flowering when it is so many weeks or so many days to a rainfall season. We have others, like here in Kenya, we have the Maasai community who they've got their old men who are so specialized in making judgment using the intestines of an animal which they've slaughtered, and they can be able to tell the weather patterns and how it's going to be. So it's many communities across Africa have got very different ways of telling weather changes and patterns that can then inform their farming activities and their other development activities. And it is important that this is recognized and integrated into modern scientific ways of telling weather patterns. And in order to do that, it is important, first of all, of course, to recognize that that is important, and then engage with the community, have inclusive mechanisms that will bring on board this knowledge to be able to be harnessed into development. For example, combining traditional agricultural practices with modern climate forecasting to improve crop resilience, because tradition in our own traditional way, we've always produced food anyway successfully, and we have also preserved it using certain traditional ways of preserving food. So we don't want to throw that away and use the Western way of doing things. We want to accommodate that. Okay. Then community engagement by involving local communities in climate adaptation planning and implementation. That can also help them to feel appreciated and participate in learning the new ways of doing things and implementing it. Then biodiversity conservation is another one. By using traditional ecological knowledge to protect and restore the ecosystem. We've always done that. So how do we harness that and integrate with the modern ways of doing things? And finally, even in disaster risk reduction, by applying indigenous knowledge of weather patterns and natural indicators, it will definitely help with early warning system. It will warn people early, to prepare early, and therefore to be able to integrate their solutions in a timely way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Another question I have is in terms of the solutions to climate change. You've mentioned quite a lot of them, but we have the tendency to think that maybe this is really for certain people, or a certain category of people, even in terms of solutions. How can climate solutions be rendered equitable such that every layer of the society benefits from it? The solutions to this climate change, as we take efforts to solve the problem. How can we ensure that it's something that trickles down from conferences, international conferences, the COP and everything, to stakeholder engagement, to national policy adoption and implementation, and eventually national, subnational, and up to the lowest level of implementation? How do we ensure that everyone benefits?
Yeah, okay. I see 4 ways here. First is inclusive policies, okay? By designing climate policies that address the needs of the most vulnerable populations within a country and across the continent. That is very important. And not just designing them, but making sure that they are implementable and that we can actually verify the benefits that come out of implementing those inclusive policies. Then secondly, you need to access resources. We need equitable access to funding, technologies, okay, information for climate adaptation and mitigation. So we need all these resources, to reach the right people. For example, the people who are very much engaged in agriculture down there. How can we make sure that the perennial funding challenge is resolved, for them to be able to access the right seeds, the right technologies for planting or developing those, and information to climate adaptation? Then thirdly is capacity building. We need to provide education and training to empower communities to participate in climate action. And that is very, very, very important. So capacity building needs to be done at different levels, whether it is at school, whether it is at, through short courses or just awareness raising of the people in the villages, that is all capacity building. And then finally, social safety nets, very, 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 very important. Implementing social protection measures to support those affected by the climate impact. That is key. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Now, one other question. In many sectors, young people are being mobilized to support advocacy for policy adoption and implementation. We see this happening a lot in public health and in many other places. I don't know if it is happening in climate change as well, but I'll ask you, first of all, is that being done in the climate in the climate sector? And I guess my question is it beneficial to implicate young people, and I would maybe add here women, in climate initiatives? They who have they usually have the mobilization power. They are very vocal. They are very active and want to do certain things. So maybe what I'm asking is, do we have enough young people across the continent implicated, enough of these young agile advocates, young women, young people and women involved in climate initiatives? And if so, are they impactful enough? Otherwise, how can they be rendered even more impactful?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think women and youth are very, very special constituencies when it comes to the climate change discourse. Currently, youth are increasingly active in climate activism, but often lack formal representation in policy making. Yeah, so there have been a few initiatives here and there by different donors and funders to support the youth to participate and engage in climate policy making and so on. But critically, much more needs to be done. And the same applies to women. The women also play a very crucial role in community resilience but are underrepresented in leadership positions and decision making. So what needs to be done going forward, in my view, is the following. The youth in particular, we need to engage them more in leadership opportunities by creating platforms for youth to participate in climate governance. That is very important. Then the second element is education, by incorporating climate education into curricula to be able to build a knowledgeable and engaged generation among the youth. And finally, innovation support. If we had funding and mentoring youth-led climate innovation and entrepreneurship opportunities, that would really be helpful. I mean, we've seen that. I mean, even in countries like Kenya here, the youth are very, very IT savvy, and a lot of them have been coming up with so many innovations that can be used in climate adaptation and mitigation. But for the women, the key solutions lie in gender-responsive policies, by ensuring that climate policies address gender-specific vulnerabilities and capacities. And then secondly, we need to have more representation of women, increasing women's participation in climate decision-making at all levels. And then finally, empowerment programs. If you support initiatives that enhance women's economic empowerment and social resilience to climate change, that will surely go a long way in empowering the women in the climate change space.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's been great having you with us, Dr. Evans Kituyi. Before we take leave of you, I'd like to ask if there's something else, and maybe any aspect that you think is worth mentioning, or maybe some departing words for us.
No, I think I just want to thank you for this. There's a lot of misconception out there and misunderstanding of what climate change really is, and what causes it, and what role that everybody can play. People have always thought that this is a white man's problem, and therefore it's the white man to resolve. But whether we reason that way or not, everybody is going to be affected by climate change, and we have to find ways of being involved in adapting, if not reducing the contribution towards this particular menace. So I hope that my few responses will be good enough to inform somebody somewhere to take relevant climate action. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Evans Kituyi. Since 1970, climate-related disasters claimed over 730,000 lives in Africa. The economic, of course, this is an economic cost, and a staggering $38.5 billion has also been spent or lost because of this situation. And of course, there's a lot of stories around resilience, the struggle, and efforts to survive. We can have all of this. But as we dive deeper into Africa's climate challenges, let's remember that solutions lie within our grasp. And as we have discussed today, we can make a difference if we explore adequate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience measures. These are the tools we need to safeguard our future. My name is Caleb Ayong, and I've been in discussion with Dr. Evans Kituyi, a senior associate of the Institute of Climate Change and Adaptation, ICCA, of the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and of course, a development expert with more than 20 years of experience, specialist in the climate change domain. Thank you for watching this maiden edition of Africa Unfiltered, a video production of Vital Voices for Africa. And we hope to see you again next month. Subsequently, keep safe. Have a great day.